My name is Robert Collins. I am 84 years old and I have been sitting in this chair for about 40 minutes now, trying to decide where to begin. I think I will begin with the worst Tuesday of my life. The best thing that ever happened to me was losing everything. My house on Birchwood Avenue, where Margaret had planted roses along the front fence. The structural engineering firm I had built from one drafting table and a telephone. My reputation in a city where I had been born and where everyone knew my name, all of it, gone inside a single afternoon. I want to tell you exactly how that afternoon saved my life. I mean that quite literally, because I believe, and I have had a great deal of time to consider this, that the man I was before September of 1963 would not have been worth very much to anyone in the long run, including himself. I do not know who you are or what has happened to you, but I suspect you are here because something in my first sentence landed somewhere true. Maybe you have already lost something. Maybe you are afraid you are about to. Or maybe everything looks completely fine and you simply feel somehow that you have been running for a very long time without being quite sure what you are running toward. I felt all of those things at once when I was your age. I want you to stay with me. This is for you.
That is me in 1961. I was 26 years old. You can see by the way I am standing, hands in the pockets of a suit I could barely afford, chin slightly up, that I already believed I had understood how the world worked. I had not. But at 26, I was very convincing. And this is Margaret. I took this photograph myself in the spring of 1962. We had been married 4 months. She is wearing a blue dress that she saved for over 7 months, putting aside a little from her teacher's salary each week, telling me nothing about it until the day it arrived. I remember thinking, I have married someone far more disciplined than I am. I was right. And this is Margaret. I took this photograph myself in the spring of 1962. We had been married 4 months. She is wearing a blue dress that she saved for over 7 months, putting aside a little from her teacher's salary each week, telling me nothing about it until the day it arrived. I remember thinking, I have married someone far more disciplined than I am. I was right. Margaret taught 3rd grade for 11 years before Catherine was born. She had a particular kind of patience that I never fully understood. The patience of someone who genuinely believes that every person in front of her is worth the trouble of understanding. I think she applied that patience to me for 51 years. I hope I was worth it. Gerald and I spent 2 years building the firm into something I was genuinely proud of. By the end of '64, we had 12 employees, draftsmen, a bookkeeper, 2 junior engineers fresh from university, a secretary named Dolores, who kept us both organized far better than we deserved. We had won 3 government contracts. We were finishing a post office. I thought we were just beginning. Gerald and I spent 2 years building the firm into something I was genuinely proud of. By the end of '64, we had 12 employees, draftsmen, a bookkeeper, 2 junior engineers fresh from university, a secretary named Dolores, who kept us both organized far better than we deserved. We had won 3 government contracts. We were finishing a post office. I thought we were just beginning.
I want to be precise about who Gerald was to me before everything happened, because I think it matters. He was not simply a business partner. He was the first man outside my family I had trusted completely, without reservation. The way you trust someone when you are young enough to believe that the people you choose say something good about you. Losing the money was devastating. Losing that trust was something different altogether. It took much longer to recover from.
Every Friday, Gerald and I had lunch at a diner called Henderson's on Fifth Street. He always ordered the same thing, black coffee and a slice of apple pie, and he always ate the pie first before anything else, which struck me as a very deliberate way to live. This photograph was taken the week before the phone call. I did not know it would be the last Friday. I do not think he knew either, though I am less certain of that now. On a Tuesday in September of 1963, I received a call from the director of the city planning office, our largest client. He told me, very carefully and very slowly, that Gerald had been redirecting client payments into a private account for 18 months. He read me some of the amounts. I remember sitting very still in my chair and looking at the framed blueprint on the wall of my office. It was for the post office we had just finished, and thinking, that building is still standing, at least that. By November, the firm was dissolved by court order. Our personal savings, everything Margaret and I had managed to put aside over 6 years of careful living, were seized as part of the civil proceedings. We had 30 days to leave the house on Birchwood Avenue. I remember watching Margaret pack the kitchen, wrapping each plate in newspaper, and she did not cry once. Not once. She just kept wrapping. 14 boxes in total. She counted them.
I want to ask you something, and I want you to take a moment before you answer. What is the thing you are most afraid of losing? Not the object or the person or the position, but what losing it would say about you. For me, losing the firm meant I was nothing. The fear was never really about the money. It was about the verdict. If I failed, I did not matter. I wonder if your deepest fear, underneath whatever shape it takes, sounds a little like that.
We moved into a one-room apartment on Elliott Street. 3rd floor, no elevator. The sort of building where you could hear your neighbors' conversations through the walls if they spoke above a whisper. The ceiling had a water stain shaped roughly like the state of Ohio, and I stared at it on many nights that winter when I could not sleep. Margaret never complained about the apartment, not the size of it, not the neighbors, not the Ohio-shaped stain. She made that room feel like it was exactly where we were supposed to be.
Margaret told me something years later. She said that in those first weeks after we moved, she had made a decision. She said, I decided that being frightened of what had happened was not the same as being frightened of you. I have thought about that sentence many times since she said it. Most people in her position would not have made that distinction. Most people would have treated the two fears as the same thing, and I would not have blamed them. She was not most people.
I found work as a draftsman at Hallowell and Associates, a firm on the other side of the city, where nobody knew who I was or what had happened. Entry level. The same technical drawings I had been assigning to junior staff 6 months before. I was 28 years old, and I sat at a drafting table in an open office with men 10 years younger than me. And every morning, I put on my coat and walked through the front door and said nothing about my past to anyone. That took more effort than anything else I did during those years. In February, I testified at Gerald's trial. I sat in that witness box for almost 3 hours and answered questions about every decision I had made, every document I had signed, every moment when I might have noticed something and did not. It was the most difficult thing I had ever done publicly, not because of the humiliation, though the humiliation was considerable, but because I had to be completely and precisely honest about the ways I had been willfully blind. There is a particular kind of shame in admitting not that someone deceived you, but that you helped them do it by not looking carefully enough. After the verdict, one of our former clients found me on the courthouse steps. I had never met him personally. Gerald had always handled his account, and I later understood why. He was a quiet man, older than me, wearing a gray overcoat. He looked at me for a moment, and then he shook my hand, and he said, "I can see that you didn't know." 4 words. I walked 4 miles home that afternoon, and I cried for the first time since September, not from sadness exactly, but from a particular relief of being accurately seen by a stranger. I have thought about that walk home many times over the years. It was a cold afternoon. February in this city is genuinely unpleasant, and I walked through it without stopping. And somewhere on the 2nd mile, I started crying, and I did not stop until I reached the door of our apartment on Elliott Street. Margaret was at the kitchen table when I came in. She looked at my face, and she stood up, and she put her arms around me, and she did not say a single word. That, I think, is when I actually began to get up.
The man in the gray overcoat said 4 words, "I can see that you didn't know." And something I had been holding for 4 months came apart completely. I have thought about that moment many times, how rarely we are accurately seen, how much we carry that nobody has looked at carefully enough to name correctly. Is there something you are carrying right now that nobody has named correctly? Something the people around you have misread or simply never thought to ask about? You do not have to answer me, but it might be worth sitting with.
Over the next 3 years, very slowly and without any announcement, the younger engineers at Hallowell began coming to my desk with questions. Not because I was senior to them, I was, officially, nobody. But they noticed I had answers, and that the answers were consistently correct, and eventually that began to matter more than my title. I said nothing about who I had been. I simply answered questions. That, I later understood, is how you rebuild a reputation. You do not explain yourself. You just keep showing up and being useful. In '67, my team at Hallowell completed a hospital, a full general hospital on the north side of the city, which was the largest project I had personally contributed to since before the collapse. On the day it opened, I went inside alone, early in the morning before the staff arrived, and I walked through every corridor on every floor and stood in the main hall for a long time, looking up at the ceiling. Buildings do not know who built them. They do not care about your history or your failures. They just stand there, serving whoever walks through the door. I have always found that deeply comforting. People ask me what I would say to Gerald today if I had the chance. I always give the same answer: nothing. Not because I am still carrying anger. The anger lasted approximately 6 years, and then one evening I sat down at my desk and wrote Gerald a letter that went to 4 pages, and I read it over once, and then I burned it in the fireplace in the living room and watched it go. That was the last time he occupied any real space in my thoughts. Anger is very expensive. It costs energy and sleep and presence. I was already short on all three.
Anger is very expensive. I meant that literally. I was spending energy I needed for other things on a debt that was not mine to carry. What are you spending right now on something that belongs to someone else? What old wrong are you still paying interest on? 6 years for me. You do the calculation for yourself and then ask, what would it actually cost to put it down? Not forgive. Forgetting is for people who have never been properly hurt, but to simply decide that the debt is paid, that you have spent enough.
This photograph was taken in 1968 in the kitchen of the apartment on Elliott Street. We were still there, still saving. Margaret has just told me, about 30 seconds before this picture was taken, that she is expecting. You can see that I have not yet decided what to do with my face. I was 33 years old, and I stood in that kitchen for what felt like a full minute without speaking, and Margaret stood there watching me with the patience of a woman who has learned to give a man time to arrive at the right response. Catherine Elizabeth Collins was born in January of 1969. Margaret had chosen the name months before, and she told me about it very matter-of-factly, as though it had never been a question. I remember holding Catherine for the first time in the hospital and thinking, I have never held anything this important before, and I have absolutely no idea what I am doing. Margaret looked at me from the bed and said, You will figure it out. She was, as usual, correct. Catherine was a serious child from the beginning, not unhappy, not difficult, simply serious. At 3 years old, she would sit and observe things for long periods before deciding how she felt about them. She watched adults the way an engineer watches a building under load, carefully, looking for the places where the structure might give. Margaret said she got that quality from me. I thought she developed it entirely on her own, and I was proud of that. When Catherine was 5, I took her to the construction site of a school we were building on the east side. She was too small for the hard hat, which kept sliding forward over her eyes, but she pushed it back each time with great seriousness and walked through the site asking questions about the columns, the foundation pour, the placement of load-bearing walls. At one point, she stopped in the middle of the main corridor, looked up at the ceiling frame, and asked me, Why did you put those there instead of there? It was a genuinely good structural question. I told her that. She nodded, as though she had already suspected as much. I want to tell you about the house on Maple Drive, because it is where most of our life happened, and because Margaret is in every room of it still, even now. We bought it in 1971 after 4 years of saving. Margaret had kept the accounts. She had a tin box in the kitchen where she kept a running ledger, and she would not let me look at it because she said correctly that I would find reasons to spend the money on something reasonable and necessary and completely wrong. When we finally had enough, she simply put the tin box on the table one evening and opened it and said, I believe we are ready. This is the house, 43 Maple Drive. We paid $38,000 for it in the spring of 1971, which was the largest sum of money I had ever committed to anything since the firm, and which made me feel slightly ill for approximately the first 6 months. The roses along the front fence were Margaret's idea and her project entirely. Within 2 years, the fence had disappeared behind them. Neighbors would stop to photograph them. She never mentioned this to anyone. Margaret gardened from the first morning we lived there. She had a particular feeling for roses. She talked to them, which I observed on many occasions from the kitchen window, without ever mentioning, because I thought she would stop if she knew I was watching, and I did not want her to stop. I remember one afternoon seeing her stand in front of the largest rose bush with her arms folded, speaking to it quite seriously, and I thought, I have been married to this woman for 11 years, and she is still regularly surprising me. I thought that was a very good sign.
On our 40th wedding anniversary, I told Margaret something I had been keeping for 40 years, that I used to stand outside the kitchen door and listen to her sing when she cooked. She had a voice she kept entirely private because she was shy about it in a way she was shy about almost nothing else, and she sang only in the kitchen, only when she thought no one could hear. I told her at dinner that I had been listening to that voice for 4 decades. She looked at me for a long moment. She laughed. She cried. Then she said, "Well, Robert, why on earth didn't you say so?" And we danced in that kitchen at 11 o'clock at night with nobody watching and nobody caring, and it was the best dance of my life.
I listened to Margaret sing in the kitchen for 40 years before I told her. 40 years. And when I finally said it, she said, "Well, Robert, why on earth didn't you say so? That is not a love story. That is a 40-year warning. Think of the person in your life who does something, some quiet, daily thing, that you have never once told them you noticed, that you have been watching for months or years, keeping it to yourself. Tell them, not when the moment is right. There is no right moment. Tell them now, while you still have the chance to hear them laugh. This photograph was taken in 1983 in the garden on Maple Drive. Catherine took it, which explains why we are slightly off-center. She had a theory that centered photographs look too deliberate, too much like documents. She said, people in a document look like they're waiting for something to be over. I think about that sometimes. She was 14 when she said it. Catherine told us at dinner one evening in the autumn of 1986 that she was going to study architecture. She was 17. I remember that I looked at Margaret across the table when Catherine said this, and Margaret looked back at me, and we did not speak. Not because we were surprised, because we were not surprised at all, but because neither of us had a word adequate to what we felt at that moment. She had been building things out of whatever was available to her since she was 3 years old. We should have seen it coming years earlier.
I worked until I was 72 years old, which is longer than most and shorter than I would have chosen if anyone had asked me. My last project was a pedestrian bridge, a small one over the river in East Side Park, nothing you would put in a book about architecture. But it is well designed, and it is well built, and the concrete shows no cracking after 15 years, and when my grandson drives me past it, I feel something in my chest that I have never bothered to name because I do not think it requires a name.
Margaret was diagnosed with cancer in 2002. She was 67 years old. She told me before she told anyone else. She sat me down in the living room on Maple Drive on the sofa, and she took my hand, and she told me plainly and clearly, and then she waited while I tried to find something useful to say. I could not find anything. I remember looking at her hands while she talked. They were the hands of someone who had spent 40 years gardening, teaching, building things, and I thought, these hands cannot be the ones we are talking about right now. But they were. I kept looking for the mistake. I kept thinking, this is the kind of thing that happens to other people. I know some of you watching this are thinking of someone right now, someone whose hands you cannot imagine that conversation being about. I want to tell you one thing, and I want you to hear it the way I needed to hear it before that evening on the sofa. You have more time than you think you do, and less than you think you do. Both of those things are true at the same time. What you do with that information is entirely up to you. She lived 9 more years after the diagnosis, 9 years of her garden and her books and Sunday lunches with Catherine and eventually with James, and that quiet singing in the kitchen that I listened to through the door for 40 years. This is a photograph from the summer of 2009. Catherine took it, which is why Margaret is off-center and genuinely laughing rather than posing. Catherine always knew how to catch her mother between the moments she was preparing to be seen. This is Margaret with our grandson James in the summer of 2010. He was 3 years old. She is showing him something in the rose garden, and he is standing with his arms at his sides and his chin slightly raised, looking at what she is pointing at with an expression of extremely serious consideration. Margaret looked at me across the garden when she saw me watching, and she mouthed 2 words, "Just like you." I chose, as I usually did with Margaret, to take that as a compliment.
Margaret died on a Tuesday in April of 2012, a Tuesday, the same day of the week as September of '63, when everything fell apart. I have thought about that coincidence more times than I can count, and I am not a superstitious man, but I will say this. Both Tuesdays changed the shape of my life completely, and both of them, eventually, after a very long time, turned out to contain something I needed.
Catherine comes every Sunday. We have lunch. She cooks because she says she worries about what I am eating when she is not here, which is probably not unfounded. And then we sit, and she tells me about her current projects. She is building a library at the moment, a large public library in the city center, and when she talks about the structural problems she is solving, I sometimes forget entirely that she is my daughter and simply listen as one engineer to another. She would not mind me saying that. She would probably consider it accurate. James is 18 now. Last month, he came to sit with me for an afternoon, and at some point, he took out his phone and said he wanted to ask me something, and then he asked, "What would you have done differently?" I told him I would have paid more careful attention to the things that made me uncomfortable, not in order to avoid them, but because discomfort is usually information, and I had a habit, when I was young, of deciding that information was inconvenient and filing it away. He wrote that down. I watched him write it down. I cannot tell you what that meant to me. There are 4 notebooks on that shelf, 84 years, and I have filled 4 notebooks with the things I thought were worth writing down. Some years are barely a page. 1963 is the longest by some distance. Margaret used to tell me I was economical with language. She said it in the fond, slightly exasperated way she said most things to me, and I thought for years that she meant it as a criticism. She told me eventually that she meant it as a compliment. I kept the notebooks. I think she was right. This photograph was taken 3 years ago. James drove me to East Side Park to see the bridge, the pedestrian bridge that was my last project. I had not been back since the opening ceremony. It is exactly as I designed it, a simple span, functional, nothing to draw your eye. James stood beside me for about 20 minutes while I looked at it, and he did not hurry me once. He is, in that way, very much like his grandmother.
If I could tell you one thing, and I have considered this carefully sitting in this chair over the course of many mornings, it would be this. The most important work of your life is not the work you did before the thing that broke you. It is the work you did after. Everything I am genuinely proud of, Catherine, the hospital, the bridge, the 51 years with Margaret, the 4 notebooks on that shelf, all of it came after the Tuesday in September of '63. The collapse was not the end of my story. It was, as it turned out, the place where my story actually started.
This is the 3 of us, James, Catherine, and me, in the garden on Maple Drive, 2023. James had just received his acceptance letter from the engineering program at the university. Catherine is pretending not to look proud, which she has been doing for 37 years with varying degrees of success. I am 81 years old in this photograph, and I am sitting in Margaret's garden surrounded by people who carry pieces of her in their faces and their gestures and their particular kinds of stubbornness. And I am content. The second cup of tea is cold again. It is always cold. I keep making 2 cups out of habit, and I keep letting the second one go cold, and I have decided that this is fine. Some habits are worth keeping not because they make sense, but because they are the shape of something true. Thank you for sitting with me today. If you have a story, and you do, everyone does, find some way to tell it before you run out of time. Someone needs to hear it. Good morning.